Hey, so I spent some time in the military, and just like everybody else, I've also worked. And I've gotten a chance to work with academics, I've gotten a chance to work with people in the private sector, and I've gotten to be in the military. And as we all know, the military is a high stress situation, especially if you're in an active unit. And there are certain things I learned about leadership. I did not have the good fortune of having too many good leaders in my military service. I think there's a lot of material out there about excellent examples of leadership in the military and people being good managers and good leaders and good squad leaders and all this other stuff. My military service was not characterized by that. It was characterized by poor leadership, to say the least. And I'm not saying this to put anyone down. I'm not going to name any names, and I don't even think that these people are to blame. I think that there's a system of incentives in place in the unit I was in that created a lot of problematic behavior. But I thought that I would share 5 ways to be a bad leader, to be a crappy leader, that I learned and have since tried to avoid in the future from my military service. So one of them is to throw your people under the bus. Throw your people under the bus. If you are in a leadership position or a managing position in an organization, and there are goals that you're being expected to meet because you have a boss, and that boss has certain expectations of you, and things do not go according to plan, and those expectations are not met, using your people as a scapegoat is a guaranteed way to make sure that they have zero loyalty to you and despise you. And I had a commander that basically did this. So we, as part of a larger company, my platoon would meet our goals, but the company itself wouldn't necessarily meet its goals. And there were a lot of reasons for this. People were sleep deprived, insufficient resources, not enough time, not enough training, you name it, it was going on. But with all of that in mind, the company as a whole wasn't meeting its goals. And the commander at the time of that company would just take the best people in the company and essentially take them to task over it. And everybody knew that these people were not the reason that this was the problem. So throw your people under the bus, and actually more specifically, throw your best people under the bus. Throw the people who are doing the most, working the hardest. Okay? That's 1. 2, let bullies, tyrants, proto-tyrants, jerks act with impunity. If you are in a leadership position of an organization and you have to deal with people who come from rough backgrounds or people who have had a rough life or something like that, and they are also being put in the same position. This probably applies to the military, schools, okay? Especially public schools, right? Because you get a certain amount of mixing of backgrounds. Whatever it is. And you have people who are from rough backgrounds and have learned to use force, either physical or force of personality, to get what they want instead of actually getting people on their side. And you let them just act with impunity. You will destroy any organizational cohesion that you have in the long run, because the people who are not pushy, okay, and I don't mean that to say that they're not assertive, it's that they're not willing to use force or harm to get what they want, will eventually just, if you let the people who are going to do that act with impunity, it will erode their confidence in you. And those are the people you want on your side. People who are cooperative are what make organizations stronger. So just an example that I had a platoon I was in, and this was later in my military service, so I already was acting as a sergeant. And we had a soldier who was violent and would threaten people. People inside my platoon, people outside my platoon. And rather than actually punishing him, or alternatively getting him out of the platoon because he really wasn't fit to serve anymore, or anything like that, because there was a certain metric where they were trying to keep as many soldiers as possible, what my commander at the time did was basically just let this guy get away with everything. And it was absolutely wrecking morale. It was absolutely wrecking morale. And I as the sergeant and the others, none of the other soldiers, the more senior soldiers, none of us had the authority to put this guy through the ringer and to just get it out of his system or anything like that. And at a certain point, I had to disarm this guy because he was busy threatening people with a weapon. So don't do that. Don't do that. If you have somebody who's a proto-tyrant, they got a bit of a Napoleon complex, they like to push people around, don't let them do that. Figure out how to use their talents and their drive and their aggression in a positive way, or get them the hell away from your people who aren't doing that. Because if you're, especially in big organizations, the more people you allow to act that way, the fewer good people you'll keep in the long run. Number 3 is assume without evidence that your people are making excuses. I started out in a combat unit. One of the things that goes on in this unit is that they push people to the point of injury. And this is to some extent necessary if you're training combat soldiers. But I found out later that that unit that I was in has a third walk away with serious injuries, meaning things that create chronic problems. That fact is not heavily publicized by the unit, obviously, but it is a very good example of assume without evidence that your people are making excuses. What do I mean by that? People would show up, they'd go to their commanders during a medical check, and they'd be like, I am in pain. I have a problem. And rather than assume that they were telling the truth, they would assume that they were making excuses to try to get out of things. Now, this was kind of a ridiculous assumption, considering, because this was a voluntary unit. This is a unit people have to test to get into. This is a unit that has a selection process, which is physically and mentally kind of challenging. It's not the hardest, most difficult special operations selection that there is out there. But it's nasty, especially for somebody who's completely untrained. And I don't think that at the beginning, anybody who was there just didn't want to be there. They just absolutely didn't want to be there. So the fact that this was coming up fast and people were getting injured and it was being ignored, which this happened to me, okay? I'm not saying that I was by no means the only soldier this happened to, and some of them managed to finish unit training and all that other stuff. But if somebody shows up and you're in a leadership position and they're like, hi, I'm sick, assuming that they're lying to you from the get-go is a violation of a very basic principle of human communication, which I think everybody should adapt, which is that you should not assume malice unless there's evidence for it. The classic one is you shouldn't assume malice where stupidity will do. But you also shouldn't assume malice just because it's not the simplest explanation for somebody coming to you and saying, I'm sick, I'm injured, I'm in pain. Okay? If one of those 3 things are going on, I'm sick, I'm injured, I'm in pain, either they actually are or something else is going on. Okay? And you need to investigate further, but you can't just jump and assume that they're lying. I really do believe that this is probably one of the fundamental core reasons that that unit has a very high rate of injury, is that people will show up and they'll really give it their all. They'll work very hard. They'll put themselves through the ringer again. This is a voluntary process, and yes, it's a draft military that I served in. I didn't serve in the U.S., but people can get out of it if they really want to. It's not that hard to get out of at the end of the day. And so if people are in a voluntary unit, especially if somebody wants to be there, they've gone through some kind of selection process, physically, mentally, whatever it is, don't just assume that they're lying to you. Assume that they probably need some either care, medical attention, something else is going on, whatever it is. Okay? Because again, it will break down cohesion, because what will happen is that people will realize after a while, the stuff gets around, people talk. If every time somebody comes to you and says, I need to take a sick day, and you're like, you're just making up excuses not to work, one of 2 things will happen. People will quit. They'll just quit. You'll lose a lot of good people because people do not like to be told that they're liars. Or 2, people will not tell you when they're sick and not tell you when they're injured. And in the long run, that's going to have very serious costs for your organization. People will either get each other sick, or they'll show up to work sick and not perform well, and then eventually they'll actually get something which is worth a lawsuit, things like that. So don't do that. 4, volunteer your people for things without actually asking them. I had a commander later in my military service who regularly, we had an NCO who would come around and look for essentially people to just do physical labor around the base. And in a lot of cases, we had operational stuff that actually needed to happen. And he would still volunteer us for things. Now, this was ridiculous on a lot of fronts. 1, this guy had never been a combat soldier. All of us were. All of us had been injured, specifically. So you have a platoon made up of injured combat soldiers. And we all knew how to work physically, but some of us were in really bad, rough shape and could not do it. And what that meant is those of us in the platoon who were in better shape and were further along in our rehab ended up just doing a ton of physical labor for this guy. In a lot of cases, we had operational stuff that still needed to happen. What that meant is that people with injuries, active injuries, in some cases neurological injuries, were having to work extra hours, way outside of what was acceptable, and even by military standards. And the other guys ended up doing a bunch of crap work for this NCO. Don't do that, okay? Volunteering your people for things is a very good way to make yourself look like a jerk as a leader. And people will start to hate you for it. And they will find ways to put you down, and they will find ways to sabotage you. If you want people to volunteer for something, ask them. If it's not volunteer, don't tell people that it's volunteer. Don't ever volunteer people. If it's something that's not volunteer, you actually have to give a certain amount of your people towards a certain task that you don't really want them doing and they don't really want to be doing. Just be like, guys, ladies, fellas, gentlemen, people, folks, this is really rough. I don't want to do this, but we need this to get done. This has to be done for the company, the larger unit, whatever it is. I don't want to take you guys off of your task, but we have to get this done. Be honest with them. Volunteering people just comes off as you trying to ingratiate yourself with your boss, which makes the people who work underneath you despise you. Okay? Number 5, keep people in the dark until the very last minute. What this is, and this was done at a certain point in my military service on purpose to make you specifically feel off balance. But later, when you're in sort of the working stage of something, unless you're in a military unit, this whole idea of keeping people in the dark really doesn't need to be done. It doesn't need to be done. You rarely have anything concrete to gain from keeping your people in the dark, not telling them what's going on. It doesn't mean you have to read them into every single detail and, the workings of any given company. There are going to be things that the people who are higher up need to know and the people who are lower down don't necessarily need to know. But think twice before you hide something from your people, because if they find out that you did and it affects their job, which it might, if you're at the top of a big organization, you don't see the bottom. It's very unlikely that you actually understand what goes on the bottom part of your organization. We're talking people, there's this concept of Dunbar's number. Dunbar was a sociologist, and this was just based around how many people you can hold relationships with. And it's not that many. And if you're in a company of 1,000, there's no way you know everybody's name. There's no way you understand what everybody's doing. The people who are in the field, whatever that is, if they're, your salespeople on at the retail level and you're higher up in the company, if it's you run, a chain of restaurants or whatever it is, and it's your servers, whatever it is, your ground people know what's going on the ground better than you do. And, if this is a school, the best example I could think of would probably be principal teachers, right? The teachers are the people actually teaching the students. The principals are further removed from that. They don't know every single student in a given classroom. Those teachers, those people in the bottom most, immediate in the field, as it's called in the military, I guess you could call this street level, okay? They know what's going on at their level better than you do. And yes, there are things that you know about that they don't, but you need to read them in on anything that might potentially affect their job. Because if you don't, and it does later, they're going to hate you for it. They're going to hate you for it. They're going to be sitting there and they're going to be silently wishing for you to fail because you didn't read them in on something they needed to know. So think twice before you hide information or keep something quiet. Don't keep people in the dark until the last minute. Let them know as early as you can. Okay? It is better to come off as annoying because you're letting people know things they don't really need to know, I would say. And I definitely had situations in the military where this was absolutely true, where commanders only let us know something right before it was about to happen. And we had to rush. And we could have very easily, because they had that information further back. And you hear stories about this from the intelligence world sometimes too. But people, generally speaking, like to be in the know. They like to feel looped in. So don't keep people in the dark, okay? Unless you absolutely have to. And definitely don't keep them in the dark until the very last minute unless you absolutely have to. So those are 5 ways to be a crappy leader. Throw your people under the bus. Permit proto-tyrants and Napoleons and all kinds of other people like that to bully everybody around and push people around and use aggression that's just not necessary. Assume without evidence that people are making excuses. Especially when it comes to something about harm, sickness, illness, anything like that. Volunteer your people for things without asking them, and keep your people in the dark until the very last minute. Those 5. Avoid doing those, you'll be better for it, your people will be happier. I'd say I guarantee it, but I'm not Denzel Washington. Have a good day.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. If you found it useful, please consider subscribing so that you can see more content like this. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them down below. Have a good one.